Welcome, everybody. I'd like to welcome the people who are here and also our virtual audience who's joining us. I wanted to let you know that there will be time for Q&A after the fireside chat. For those of you who are joining us virtually, you can submit your comments or questions to rockyqa@dartmouth.edu. And for the people who are here, there's a microphone. So if you have a question, please wait until we bring the microphone to you so that the people in the virtual audience can hear your question. So our conversation this evening is going to be moderated by Professor Elizabeth Wilson. She's a professor of environmental studies and founding director of the Arthur L. Irving Institute for Energy and Society. Wilson studies how energy systems are evolving in the face of new technology, societal pressures, and risks. Her current research focuses on the development of offshore wind. Among her many honors, in 2015, Wilson was awarded an Andrew Carnegie Fellowship. Prior to joining Dartmouth College, Wilson was a professor of energy and environmental policy and law at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota. Our special guest for this evening is Professor David Spence. He is the Rex G. Baker Centennial Chair in Natural Resources Law at the University of Texas School of Law and Professor of Business, Government, and Society at UT Austin's McCombs School of Business. Professor Spence is an expert in government regulation of the energy industry. He is the author of Climate of Contempt, Rescuing the U.S. Energy Transition from Voter Partisanship, published by Columbia University Press. He also is co-author of the energy law textbook entitled Energy, Economics, and the Environment, and various scholarly articles on energy regulation and policy. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Spence to the stage.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. It's been a fun day here at Dartmouth for me. I haven't been here in, I think, 35 years, something like that. So it's been fun to come back. I want to especially thank the Environmental Studies Department and the Rockefeller Center for hosting me, and especially Elizabeth Wilson, and then all the team at the Rockefeller Center and Environmental Studies that actually did the logistical work to make this happen. Devora, Kim, Madison, and several others really deserve the credit for sort of organizing everything here. And I want to talk for about 20 minutes or so, marking the time here, so we have plenty of time for a Q&A, because I think that'll be the interesting part of this. So I'm going to summarize the book, and I'm going to use one slide at least here. There's a picture of the book. There is a optimistic number of books on the table back there for anybody that wants to pick up a copy from Norwich Bookshop. They have some. I'll give you the bare bones outline of what the book tries to do. It tries to do a lot of things, and so I'll hit on all of them briefly, but we'll save for the Q&A going into detail on whichever parts of it you think you're most interested in. So the basic idea behind the book, and it's really suggested by the picture in the lower right-hand side of the slide, is that the information environment, the modern information environment, particularly the mix of new media with traditional media, is distorting our understanding of the politics of energy transitions, including the energy transition that is underway right now, and really of all complex regulatory issues. And these issues are the dominant discussion of these issues, the dominant narratives are omitting part of the story. That's what motivated me to write the book, was to try and re-inject some of what we know from empirical political science literature and other fields back into those debates. The dominant narratives are a little bit simpler. They're not as messy or as complicated or as morally ambiguous as I think the politics of these transitions actually is. And so the book goes into some detail about that, why that is, and it starts with history. And I'll talk about the history in just a second, but the premise here is that we need congressional legislation if we're going to complete the energy transition. The term energy transition in my world means moving eventually to a net zero carbon emission economy. We often talk about the goal of that of doing that by 2050 or mid-century, but in any reasonably timely manner. And that's a complicated, messy sort of trajectory full of all kinds of value choices. We need the congressional legislation because the market won't do it alone. The market's doing a lot of good things now, and some states are doing a lot of good things, but not all states will do that, certainly not mine, Texas. So we need national legislation regulating greenhouse gas emissions, and it's the politics of that question that I'm ultimately getting at in this book. The historical part of the book talks about how we have gotten regulatory legislation in the past. And it really is designed to be a primer for anybody who wants to really understand the regulatory regimes created by statutes over time that constitute the regulation system for the energy industry today. And those regulatory regimes date all the way back to the late 19th century. They were passed by Congress in episodes of productivity that were relatively few and far between. Congress is only capable of producing regulatory legislation some of the time, and in this case, a relatively small slice of American history accounts for most of, I think, the administrative state and almost all of the energy regulatory state. And that history is much more of a bottom-up story than we tend to hear about, especially lately. These were statutes that were passed when people were dissatisfied with the status quo because of changes in energy technology that allowed some people to get very rich and to control the new technology or resource, and to exploit other people who weren't happy with that change in circumstances. And members of Congress, because they care about getting reelected and because they try to maximize their popularity, detected that unhappiness and championed the cause of passing regulatory legislation to change or remedy that problem. Now, you need that groundswell of support. We call these Republican moments in the book. That's a term that I borrow from someone else, small r Republican. You need that groundswell of support, but you also need a receptive Congress, a partisan environment that's receptive in Congress to get over the hump, to get the majorities you need for legislation. And so I tell the story of the creation of the regulatory state and the energy regulatory state through chapter 1 of the book. And we talk about maybe 40 or 50 statutes in that chapter and the politics of their creation. All were incredibly popular when passed. All of them had 75% or more support in both houses of Congress when passed. And they were signed, of course, by presidents. And so they tended to be these sort of bottom-up movements. So they were passed over the objections of often powerful people who were, benefiting wildly from the status quo. So the question is, why were we able to do that in the past, and why can't we do it now? The most recent of these productive periods was sort of the 1970s and the years surrounding the 70s, when most of the modern environmental regulatory state was created. Before that, the productive periods were the New Deal and let's say 30 years surrounding the turn of the 20th century. Those were the productive periods in the past, and it turns out that they were productive because you had that receptive partisan environment. Either one party dominating, really, massively dominant in both houses of Congress and the presidency, as in the New Deal, when Democrats had enormous majorities. If you were to go to Wikipedia and look up what the imbalance of party control during the New Deal is, you almost wouldn't believe it. The smallest margins in the House that Democrats had during the entire New Deal were 196 seats. That is 196 seats more than the Republicans had. And the rest of the New Deal, it was even a bigger imbalance. And so that's when you can do whatever you want as a party. But you can also get things done when there's some bipartisan support for an issue. And that's what happened in the progressive era, when both parties were competing to be associated with the new progressive impulse and progressive movement. It's also what happened in the 1970s when we got the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and most of the other major environmental laws that we know today. So what's different about today that makes it more difficult for Congress to pass climate regulation, that is regulation of greenhouse gas emissions? Even though it's a very popular idea, it has majority support including majority support among young Republicans. Why can't we do that now? Well, the answer I offer in the book is that voters have changed, and the set of voters to whom members of Congress respond have changed. And let me explain what I mean by that. So in the late 20th century, the parties started to move apart ideologically. So this is political polarization that most people have heard of, and both voter polarization and congressional polarization have been measured by political scientists, and that phenomenon has been documented beginning really after the Reagan administration, when the GOP started to move to the right ideologically, and about 2 decades later, the Democrats started to move to the left. And so that nowadays, the parties' respective agendas and goals are very, very different, more divergent than they used to be back in the days when there were some Republicans to the left of some Democrats in Congress. We're here in the Rockefeller Center. Nelson Rockefeller was a liberal Republican, and somebody who grew up in Western New York State. All my representatives were liberal Republicans. My Senator, Jacob Javits, my congressman was a guy named Frank Horton. Then there was another one named Barbara Conable. They were all moderate Republicans that really don't exist anymore. At least they're considered rhinos, as we say, Republicans in name only. And so we don't have that sort of overlap, ideological overlap anymore. That's true of voters as well. So that's one change. Voters also changed in that they became more negatively partisan over time, and that's more of a 21st century phenomenon. We measure the feelings or attitudes of voters toward a whole bunch of things every so often in the National Election Study and in other ways as well. And those attitudes about the other party have taken a sharp turn for the worse. The data on the right is from the National Election Study, which is feeling thermometer data that if you've looked at that poll before, you know what that is, but it's basically a score that the respondents are asked to assign to the other party's members, 100 being I couldn't love them more, 0 meaning I couldn't hate them more. And up until around the turn of the 21st century, those numbers were mildly negative. And you wouldn't expect them, you'd expect them to be less than 50 if you're talking about the party that you don't belong to. So it was in the 40s for most of the 20th century. But then it took a sharp turn downward after that, and now we have alarming percentages of people who are willing to assign a score of 0 to members of the other party. And then this aligns with changes in the way we describe members of the other party, which you see in the Pew Research data here. You see strong majorities of people attributing, quite negative characteristics to members of the other party. The only place in which both parties don't agree that the other party is bad is in the score of laziness. Democrats apparently don't ascribe laziness to Republicans as much as Republicans. I don't know what that's about, so I'm not going to look into it anytime soon, but so that's another way in which voters have changed. They become negatively partisan. This is sometimes called affective partisanship by political scientists. It's not so much about issues as about your partisanship as a part of your cultural identity, and it's much more negative than it ever has been in the period we've been measuring it. So those two things have changed, and I said that the set of voters to which members of Congress respond has changed as well. And what's going on there is that congressional seats have gotten much less competitive over time. I have a slide on that. This is Cook Political Report data, and I couldn't find any nice pictures going back to the 70s, but the 94 picture there, these are pictures that show congressional districts and how dominant one party's voters are within that district. Over time, due to both individual voluntary sorting and gerrymandering, more and more districts have become safe for one party or the other. That is, there's overwhelming dominance by voters of one party in that district, which means that if you're the nominee of the dominant party, you face virtually no risk of losing the next election. And so politicians that are worried about voters and worried about getting reelected don't have to worry about the average voter in the district or the median voter in the district. They have to worry about the average voter in a primary. And the average voter in a primary are those people who are now much more ideologically, away from the middle and much more negatively partisan. And so the way members of Congress protect their reelection prospects is to cater to those extreme partisans. And this creates some of the nasty rhetoric that we see these days. And it's that negative partisanship that I think is tied to the rise of new media. And let me spend a little time on that because I think that chapter, which is chapter 4 of the book, is sort of the fulcrum of the argument here. But nowadays, the way people gather information and process it to form political beliefs is very different than it used to be when I was the age of the students here at Dartmouth. It used to be that almost all of your information came from trained journalists who at least aspired to objectivity. They may not have always achieved that aspiration, but they aspired to objectivity. They had editors they had to please. They had a broad, ideologically heterogeneous audience that they had to write for. And they produced information or stories that that they had time to produce because there wasn't an instantaneous news back then. It was a daily newspaper or a nightly newscast. And it wasn't nearly as competitive a news environment as it is today. And so we had time to read the stories or watch the stories that they produced for us in full. And we could read to beyond the lead, beyond the headline, beyond the first paragraph to the 10th and 20th paragraph of the story, where you find all the sort of interesting complexity and caveats and qualifications and things that might sort of countermand or counteract the impression you got from the headline. And you sort of learn to look for those things. If you're trying to learn today and you have this barrage of information coming at you that still includes some of that kind of news, but it also includes ideological or advocacy journalism that's aiming to persuade you in addition to educating you. It also includes bots and press releases and other things that are only about persuading you, sometimes for malicious purposes. Finding that good information, all sides of the story that used to be contained within your news, is harder. You have to work harder to get it. And moreover, the way you process the information you get is different as well. We didn't have, social media to talk to each other about these things. We had to process information by talking to family, friends, neighbors, coworkers in person, with all the context that in-person communication gives us. And so, facial cues, and we knew the other person. We wanted to preserve the relationship with the other person, which affects the way we talk to each other. We wouldn't begin a conversation by calling some idea that they might hold idiotic. We'd ask. We'd start with questions. What do you think about this or that? And so that's a very different way of processing information and of auditing your own first impressions. Now, all of that happens a lot quicker. The information you're getting is, as you all well know, censored by algorithms that give you more of what you want and less of what you don't want. And you often will discuss it online in a social media community right away, as soon as you see the news. And in those communities, because of what we know about how the communities form and change over time, it's likely that you will be among very like-minded people and less likely to be talking to someone who has a different point of view. The different point of views rarely get into these ideological bubbles online, according to the empirical research. And that makes it hard for us to learn to understand all of the complexity associated with the energy transition. And so we get into these places where, propositions that are treated as obvious truths in one bubble are treated as absurd and ridiculous in another bubble. And until we start having cross-bubble communication, that's likely to remain the case. It also helps us ascribe all those negative characteristics to the other side, just people in other groups. These are things I call attribution errors in the book. We tend to, it's human nature to want to explain outcomes that we don't like as illegitimate in some way, shape, or form, and that often, manifests as broad generalizations about entire groups of people that are typically counterproductive because if you're a member of the group to which that generalization doesn't apply, it will offend you, and you'll be less likely to want to talk to those people and work out some sort of problem and build a congressional majority for strong climate action. So we're stuck in this situation where it's risky for politicians to cooperate across the aisle, politically risky, and we have an electorate that's sort of, at each other's throats. At least the ones who vote in primaries are at each other's throats. And so chapters 5 and 6 of the book, and I'll do this quickly because I'm already past my 20 minutes. Chapters 5 and 6 of the book are really about diving into how this affects discussion of the trade-offs involved in getting to a net zero carbon economy. And those trade-offs are, important. They're difficult. They involve value choices. They would involve negotiation. If we can be honest about them. It's harder to be honest about them when we're in that lobbying mode and we care urgently about the issue. We tend to, in the words of one of the people I quote in the book, a writer, sand the inconvenient edges off the facts when we talk about things online, because there's a potential audience there. We want to persuade them. We want them to, in the words of Bertrand Russell, believe the thing that we think would have socially beneficial effects if it were widely believed. It's just motivated reasoning. It's the same sort of biases that are sort of common in our life, but they're supercharged in the modern information environment. It's a constant, omnipresent devil on your shoulder, inviting you to think the worst about the other side. And so the trade-offs chapter is about sort of being transparent about the trade-offs between how dirty or clean our energy system is, how much it costs, and how secure we want it. We want all those things to be true. We want it to be clean. We want it to be affordable. We want it to be reliable. And I think we can do that, but we can't do it if we're sanding the inconvenient edges off the facts and we don't trust one another. It's hard to sort of deal with these trade-offs if we are polarized and negatively partisan. So chapter 6 is about how we can talk to each other more productively across ideological and partisan divides. And the short version of that is that when I went to research communication experts, communication scholars, political psychologists and psychologists generally, philosophers, historians, they all had very similar prescriptions. And it was all about conversation as a relationship building exercise, an iterative process about maintaining trust, inquiring about the other person's beliefs, not sort of hoping to win the conversation, but rather hoping to gain deeper understanding of each other's points of view, which inherently plants seeds, right? These are questions that we wouldn't ask ourselves necessarily. So when you talk to someone face to face from a different point of view, you're going to audit your beliefs in a way that makes your understanding deeper and better. And ideally, hopefully, and we can talk about how reasonable that hope is, that's the kind of bottom-up corrective, or part of the kind of bottom-up corrective that can help to reverse the very much, I think, bottom-up process that has driven us into this state of dysfunction. So I'm happy to go into any detail about any of those issues that you want to talk about, but I think right now we're going to sit down and have our fireside chat without a fire. Okay, thank you. Thank you for your time.
Great. Thank you so much for coming to Dartmouth on your tour. David is appreciating the cool weather that we can offer here. And we first met at the Austin Electricity Conference, I want to say 20 plus years ago, but I know it wasn't that long.
Probably 15 maybe, yeah.
And what always struck me about the Austin Electricity Conference, well, it's the only electricity conference where the motto is God, air conditioning, and markets. I'm joking, but you're having the conversation in such a different environment. And one of the things about this book that I found so interesting was the fact that you're really building from that environment to kind of come up and build the thesis for this book. Could you talk a little bit more about how Texas, but just such a different perspective on energy and the energy system have played in to how this book is structured?
Yeah, and you tell me if I don't get at what's driving your question, but there's sort of two things that I think of. One is that the Texas electricity market is different from most other markets. It's very open. There's to build a power plant in Texas, all you have to do, as far as the state is concerned, is register. You don't have to get a permit. Now, there's local zoning and things like that, but you have to get an interconnection permit to the grid, but otherwise, you just do it, right? And And because Texas has a lot of wind resources, and because Texas built a bunch of transmission lines, which was a government-pushed idea, we have a lot of wind. Wind is the cheapest, or wind and solar are the cheapest on a levelized cost basis or per kilowatt hour basis forms of energy. So entrepreneurs went out to West Texas and built a whole bunch of wind. The transmission was there to get it to Houston and Dallas and San Antonio and Austin. And so consequently, we have tons of wind. We have a market that price-wise is close to unregulated. It is regulated, but we allow the prices to go very, very high on the theory that the market will solve our problem kind of theory. Those high prices will induce people to invest in whatever generation is necessary to keep the lights on. Now, we've come close to not keeping the lights on a few times in the last few years, and now the legislature is starting to prop up natural gas plants because they either to throw a bone to the natural gas industry or because they believe it's necessary to keep the lights on. So that's one thing. Our market is different. The other is that for me, and I talked about this in the last chapter, is that the oil and gas industry is around, right? And it's hard. I always like to say we put a human face on the oil and gas industry in Texas, or you'll know people who work in that industry if you live there and you work in the energy field. Some of my students go work there. A lot of them go work in renewables as well. But you can't demonize real people. The other day I was using the analogy to what's happening in Springfield, Ohio with the Haitians. It's a very Republican town. The Republicans from outside Springfield are calling in bomb threats. I assume it's Donald Trump people, but I don't really know that. But in Springfield, they're going out of their way to patronize the Haitian restaurants because they don't want these people to be demonized because they know them, right? So I appreciate being around the oil and gas industry. I think it helps me not, all my other social forces push me to the left, and so I think it helps me maintain a little bit of a balance.
And so when you're thinking then, I mean, one of the pieces, if anyone wants to take Environmental Studies 12, Energy and Environmental Policy in the winter term, we will be reading section 1 of David's book, because I think you really do a great job of providing that regulatory history of the energy system and kind of how it's evolved over time. And when you were talking about the Texas story, it really comes in kind of in that late second to third phase, right? And what factors do you see shaping the energy system and the political components of the energy system there now?
In Texas? Yeah, so I think ever since Winter Storm Uri, which was a traumatic event in Texas and caused the entire board of the grid operator to resign and the entire Public Utility Commission to resign. Ever since then, there's been a lot of angst about the reliability of the Texas grid. And in the most recent legislative sessions at the state legislature, there have been a bunch of bills that would penalize renewables and prop up natural gas. Now, the penalizing renewables bills, except for one, didn't pass. And the same thing with the propping up of natural gas, except for one bill. Actually didn't pass. What they passed was a referendum, and then the referendum passed. And so we're starting to see the legislature, which I think of as sort of traditionally sort of populist Republican, starting to turn a little bit against renewable energy, at least in part. And that's kind of consistent with what we see in national messaging. If you look at the Republican platform, it's very much a fossil fuel platform right now, not generally positive toward renewables, even though red states have a lot of renewables. So it'll be interesting to see if what wins out, the sort of interests of the people in those states that work in the renewable industry or that national messaging.
I wanted to drive us here because in your book you talk about facing the energy transition trade-offs. And I know in Texas you have the most wind on the system of any system, I mean in terms of megawatts, gigawatts built. And yet the politics are so hard. When you're thinking about how the trade-offs of the energy transition are playing off both in Texas but then also nationally, some of the specific elements are so rich. Can you give us some other examples that are really grounded in kind of the energy system and how the technologies are being framed or thought about differently, and that those struggles of kind of
Yeah, well,
trade-offs.
I say that, I mean, I do talk about the trade-offs in that tripartite way, so affordability, reliability, clean. But I also say that those trade-offs are managed differently in different places because the institutional environment is different in different places. So the Texas market is pretty unique. California has a lot of renewables. It all came most of it came from the top down. These were mandates to build renewables for the most part. And so you can do it more than one way, right? But the trade-offs manifest differently in different places. In Texas, because we're such a free market state, when and if the presence of more weather-dependent generation on the system causes short periods of shortage, prices go through the roof. They can go 5 times higher here than they can go here because the cap is 5 times higher, the government-imposed cap. And so it's a much more of a Wild West kind of approach to managing the trade-off between costs and reliability and green energy. And I think those trade-offs in California are managed in an entirely different way, and they have plenty of reserves. They also have very high default prices, right? So people in California, because they've built all this stuff that they want, the price per kilowatt hour is very high all the time, right? The average price per kilo, much higher than in Texas. You have high prices here too, but theirs are even higher, and so you're seeing pushback now just because of cost and prices. And a lot of that's wildfire liability as well that eventually ratepayers have to pay for.
So in your book, you talk a lot about creating the climate consensus to pass national legislation. And we can talk about that, but I'm also really concerned that right now, anyway, we have a really hard time getting stuff actually built.
Yeah.
And I know you think a lot about this, so I wanted to make sure that became part of the conversation.
Yeah, one of the trade-offs that's discussed in Chapter 5 is about, it's packaged as a cost, but it's really about local opposition to building new stuff, new energy infrastructure.
That's big here in New England.
Yes, I know.
We like to oppose all kinds of new energy infrastructure.
Yeah, you have a hard time meeting your ambitions when it comes to green energy.
On paper, they're great.
Yeah. There is a fairly extended discussion of that dynamic of local opposition. We sometimes call it NIMBY or not in my backyard opposition, but I don't mean that as a pejorative. It's just, I think it's logical for some people to oppose new infrastructure in their neighborhood if they're not getting any benefits from it, and they're going to have to bear some kind of cost, even if it's just an aesthetic cost, right? So that is the germ of opposition that then tries to grow its power by bringing new people on and grabbing onto issues that they can grab onto to stop something. And most of our regulatory system, or the environmental part of the regulatory system, was built to create those veto gates to stop projects whose forward momentum was economic, but might not have been considering the environmental impacts very well. And so we have all these levers that opponents can use. And sometimes they can, string out a project to the point where it dies economically, even if they lose all the legal battles along the way. That's what happened to Cape Wind here in New England. They won every legal battle, but by the time they did that, the contract had expired to finance the project. And so, that local opposition is a problem. I think we're making some progress on that. The use of community benefit agreements is becoming more common. Negotiations with the local community becoming more sophisticated and trying to buy some acceptance that way. The bill in Congress, the Barrasso-Manchin bill, is kind of controversial, but it would streamline permitting.
I think the word you used was log rolling.
Yes, it would streamline permitting for everything, for fossil fuel projects and for clean energy projects. And so the question is, will that buy acceptance, or will that just buy more opposition, depending on whether you want something more or less than you don't want the other thing, right? So,
and I just want to bring in one more issue before we open it up to the question and answer period. Yesterday, of course, Hurricane Helene wiped out big parts of western North Carolina. And here in Vermont, Waterbury, Vermont, in the last year has flooded 3 times in a 1-year period. And so we're seeing these extreme weather events destroying our communities. And as you're thinking about the energy transition, how are you balancing the adaptation to this crazily changing climate with the need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and mitigate in hand in hand? How do we think about those as an opportunity or a challenge or
Yeah. I mean, adaptation is not a choice, right? So I lived 10 years of my life in North Carolina. The Outer Banks of North Carolina is an extremely vulnerable place. And so there have the Route 12 that goes up the Outer Banks is now, what used to be a road is now becoming bridges in many places, right? And so you're gonna have to spend one way or the other. And so the question is, do you want to do it to mitigate? It's a hard thing politically because the mitigation now will be a benefit in the future, and we're not very good at making those things immediate in the voters' minds. But yeah, we don't have a choice but to adapt, and so towns are relocating inland. There's a town in Alaska, another one in Louisiana that are already relocating inland. In California, all the state has ordered the coastal towns to plan for managed retreat because the cliffs there move inland faster than with erosion faster than on someplace where there isn't a cliff. You can tell I'm not really a topography guy, but yeah. So I don't think we have any choice but to do that. But the problem is that it's not a cliff; it's a continuum. So it'll all get worse if we don't mitigate as well. And so I think that's why it's worth continuing to work on that issue.
Great. And I think we have a microphone if we have questions. And if you want to raise your hand, I'll keep a queue. But anyone open us? Let's start with the gentleman with the watch on next to the wall there. And then, and please introduce yourself and where you're from as well.
Sure. Thank you. Hi, I'm Michael Maloney. I'm a graduate student in the Guarini School. I'm from New York. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on the Inflation Reduction Act and any of the kind of positive effects on partisanship resulting from some of the green jobs that are being created in red and purple states.
Yeah.
Georgia is a good example. And to what degree, if you do think that, to what degree sustaining some of those improvements are tied to kind of US centric supply chain, us needing to be part of mineral extraction and kind of reducing some of our dependency on China to kind of keep that going over the longer run. Thank you.
Yeah, there's a lot in that question. So you're right. I think that the political theory behind the Inflation Reduction Act, which for those of you who don't know, is a series of mostly tax credits and other financial benefits that are quite generous and bigger, broader, and longer duration than any tax credits for clean energy we ever had in our history. And there's lots of money going out, being dispersed now by the Biden administration to fund a lot of these new projects. And the theory there is that will create an economic investment in these industries. The political theory is that will create an economic investment that will translate into support, voter support, and then ultimately politician support for continuing to rely on and build those industries. That's partly, it is tied to a sort of building it's like a domestic jobs program for the clean energy industry. And some of that is international security goal as well, because China controls so many of the critical minerals that we need for batteries and solar panels and things like that. So I think we are seeing it already have some effects. It's pretty early in the life of these projects to expect voters to embrace these issues, but we are already seeing some effects in the form of 17 House Republicans writing to the Speaker saying, if we win everything in November, we don't want you to repeal everything in the Inflation Reduction Act like you were promising to. And so we'll see whether they win everything in November, then we'll see what happens in the House. If the Republicans retain the House, what they'll do. I don't know that's a theory of voter behavior that relies on them sort of identifying their job and their economic prospects with the energy transition, and then that has to sort of translate into their vote. And a lot of these are rural places or very red states where that cultural identity works against moving toward the Democratic Party. We'll have to. I would never try to predict whether that's going to work or not, but it's entirely possible that with the ever-present devil on your shoulder of the sort of messaging that comes from online, everything that happens will be translated through the, or understood through the prism of sort of politics and partisan politics. And that's, on the other hand, we see members of Congress who voted against the Inflation Reduction Act happily taking credit for the projects that are happening in their districts. They apparently don't see much electoral risk in doing that. So it's going to be an interesting, your question is an interesting one, and I don't know what's going to prevail in the end, but it's the sort of thing I would want to keep my eye on. How do votes change, if at all, in those districts where IRA money is creating a lot of jobs? I dodged your question, but I hope I answered it in some way.
How about here on the aisle, the young woman? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Katie. I'm a freshman from Illinois. I was wondering what you thought, or if you have any thoughts about the scope of carbon pricing mechanisms in the energy transition, like how the government could facilitate that. I know you mentioned like the market is pretty insufficient at regulating those things, but like the scope of that?
Well, we don't really have carbon pricing. A hefty chunk of academics had always liked carbon pricing, particularly economists.
Well, the economists, yeah. Last 30 years.
And there's a set of people who think that in the end, for certain hard to decarbonize industries, we're not going to get there without carbon pricing in some form. And carbon pricing doesn't have to be a tax. It can be a tradable permit system that creates a price on rights to pollute. But so the scope of it is zero right now, right, in the United States. And other countries have it. And it's hard sometimes for places that have it, to make the price, if it's a tax, high enough to sort of really represent the social cost of carbon, because those estimates have gone way, way up in recent years. And so it's a transparent cost that politicians have a hard time embracing. Yeah.
Great. I'll take a question over here, maybe. Thanks, Deborah.
Hi, I'm Nathan. I'm a 25, so a senior, studying engineering from Davis, California. And also for capstone engineering work right now, I might be using some IRA funding to build infrastructure in Lebanon, which is pretty exciting. You were mentioning that we haven't had like a productive legislative time for energy since the 1970s, and you cited the reason for that as like partisanship and the nature of the partisanship now. I guess I'm curious. I was surprised to hear nothing about like special interests, so like oil and gas, and how they kind of employ lobbying and money to kind of counter efforts towards renewables. And I was kind of wondering what the role is there, how you view that, and what effect that has.
Yeah, the oil and gas industry in particularly the biggest super major companies have known, or at least their research units have known about climate change for a very long time, like 50 years. Well, 40, 50 years, speaking of Exxon and Shell mainly. And much of the industry contributed to a trade association that spread disinformation about climate science in the 90s and early 2000s called the Heartland Institute. And then several major or best-selling books sort of tell the story of those efforts. I'm thinking of Jane Mayer's Dark Money, Merchants of Doubt, and Democracy in Chains. And those that's what I was referring to early on as sort of the dominant part of the narrative, that everybody agrees the system is rigged, and on the left we think it's rigged by those interests, and on the right they think it's rigged by coastal elites or whatever. So there are lobbyists who represent people who benefit from the status quo, who try to stop changes to the status quo. But the political science empirical research that I talk about in chapters 2 and 3, well, 1 and 2, I should say, suggests that they don't really control the process the way the popular narrative suggests they do. They, all else equal, having a lot of money to lobby is better, but as it turns out, when a lot of money goes in on one side, lobbying money goes in on one side of a congressional issue, a lot of lobbying money comes in on the other side. And one way to think about this is, the left has its super wealthy people too, like Bill Gates and Tom Steyer and Michael Bloomberg, right? And they work in opposition to the Koch brothers and others. But one thing they don't do as well as the rich guys on the right, rich people on the right, is they haven't played the long game sort of information funding think tanks and things like that support particular points of view. And there's no doubt that those think tanks have had some effect. But I'm skeptical that, for example, if the Koch brothers hadn't, or those think tanks had never existed, I'm skeptical that we would have regulation right now that would limit greenhouse gases to levels below what we already are at. And the reason I'm that skeptical is because as the IPCC reached its conclusions and started to get really confident about human-driven climate change, that was around the time that Congress separated, the parties separated, there was no overlap, and the negative partisanship was starting to ramp up. So, and you also see this in the bills in the early 2000s that were climate bills that were bipartisan in 2004, 5, and 6. John McCain and the guy from Vermont, Chafee, and a few other people were sponsors along with a larger number of Democrats. And they got through the House in 2009, but by the time the Senate was supposed to deal with them, we were already in this environment of polarization and partisan nastiness. And so I think while none of us can predict what would have happened in an alternate past, it's by no means a foregone conclusion that but for all that misinformation, we'd have a vastly different emissions profile right now, at least in my opinion.
I mean, I think this is actually one of the more contentious points of your book, and
Yeah,
when I
think so
talked to you
too.
about it. I mean, because there was this myth that if we just created the best technologies and that oil we'd stop using oil.
Yeah.
And this year we've used more oil than ever before in the history of the planet, and we have a lot of renewables, and we have a lot. So it's been an and story, not a substitution story.
Right.
And where I see it is not on the national level, but I'm looking at the project and state level, where you have Save the Right Whales, who are funded by the Texas Public Policy Institute, which are funded by, and so you see it at the project level and kind of where can we stick gum in our NEPA processes and in our lawsuits to drag this out. And so if you could just help us pick that apart a little, because I think Nathan's question.
Yeah, I mean that also is part of the NIMBY story too. So,
but I'm funding NIMBY from outside interest groups that have fossil fuel interests.
but a lot of NIMBY is get funding from outside. Yeah, so
Fair.
So I think the way I think about opposition to projects generally is that there are sincere local opponents, and then their strength is amplified sometimes by outside funders, right? And often those outside funders try to hide their participation. AstroTurf groups. Yeah, you know what you all know that term? Fake grassroots groups are AstroTurf group. But so I don't think it's definitely true that they have more resources and can be more aggressive. Cape Wind is like the classic example that they have very wealthy backers, and that can amplify their power. It doesn't remove from the equation the actual local people who are going to be in front of the camera when the reporters come and are going to tell their story, and they're happy to have that outside funding because they feel they have a just cause, right? And so we still have to talk to those people, right? We still have to, deal with them and face the fact that some of what we want to do is going to impose a cost on them. And hopefully we're getting better at that part of the process. And exposing the outside funding, I think is, that's just something that has to happen if we can do it.
Well, and I appreciated this multi-layered way of thinking about it, from the local level to the gerrymandering to the propaganda environment, and how it amplifies one another to these pieces.
Right.
Question from the back. How about in the black sweater? Lift your hand up. Wait for the microphone, please, and introduce yourself. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Maria. I'm from North Country, New Hampshire. And first of all, thank you, Dr. Spence, for giving your talk. I'm taking ENVS 12 with Professor Wilson in the winter, so I'll get to read the first chapter of your book, fingers crossed.
First section.
First section. Oh, exciting. Okay. And regarding your book, you mentioned that chapter 6 talks about popping the ideological bubble. And I'm assuming that from Texas, you have these twin industries of fossil fuels and renewable energy, which make for pretty bipartisan conversations in your state, on your campus. maybe you know the ideological tale of a lot of colleges in the US that kind of skew liberal. I was wondering if you see a path forward for bipartisan conversation, not just in Dartmouth's campus about energy, but on a lot of institutes of higher educations, their campuses.
Well, one of the things about going to college is that you hopefully are being exposed to, new and different points of view, I hope. In a classroom, most professors, I think, try to force you to be exposed to all sides of an issue. That's part of becoming an expert, right? That's what you're becoming. You're developing expertise by understanding everything about an issue. And it's been my experience that students really want that more than ever because it's so hard to get in the modern information environment otherwise. And so it can involve cognitive dissonance if you're really dug in on something that turns out to be a myopic view of an issue. But the best way to do it, if you're not going to automatically run into those points of view, is to go, ask people questions. How do you feel about this? Does everybody in your family agree with you? What do they say? It's all about questions. Chapter 6 includes some conversational techniques. Some of you may know Katherine Hayhoe, the climate scientist. She wrote a book called Saving Us. I excerpt her a little bit. I excerpt some political scientists and several other people from other fields that all sort of talk about this approach to having conversations that are open-ended questions where you actually listen to the answer and use the answer in your next question, right? So that's how influence happens. It's not, people don't disagree with you because they lack information that you have. And you telling them the true information isn't going to change their mind. It's really about continuing to question and think critically about not just what they believe, but what you believe as well, and trying to find, that kind of conversation. So you may have to work harder to get it if you don't run into people automatically, but I'm pretty sure that Dartmouth campus has people from all points of view. If you are in a liberal bubble, then go do your studying at either the Tuck or the engineering school.
Yeah, here in the green shirt. Thank you, Deborah.
Hi, I'm Sebastian. I'm a freshman from Virginia. My question was relating to when you were talking about reliability trade-offs. I was listening to a podcast you run recently where you referenced that the 3 Mile Island partial failure got you interested in energy.
Yeah.
And then hearing about in the last couple of weeks how that seems to be reopening because Microsoft needs 20 years of power for data centers.
Yeah.
I was wondering how we should price in the boost of demand in energy that is driven by like AI data centers, cloud computing, that hasn't been priced into decarbonization efforts in the past, and how we should balance reliability with that.
Yeah, so that is what we used to call the $64,000 question, but now that number makes it sound minor. That is the big question that everybody's talking about right now, because grid planners are projecting just such massive increases in demand, and they're panicking about it. And so the Microsoft deal this is the other unit of 3 Mile Island, not the one that melted down. It's one that operated fine until its end of its useful life and then closed in, 2017 or something like that. So we're seeing in that deal that people who are building AI are worried about the reliability of the grid too, and there being enough supply, and so they're willing to pay what I assume is a pretty good-sized premium, because nuclear is pretty expensive, even in a retrofitted plant or restarted plant. It's still going to be pretty expensive. So these are all signals that we've got a problem that we have to solve. And every regional grid operator is trying to tackle this in different ways. Some people think that AI should be the servers should be paying the cost of this, paying a lot more, because there's such a sort of unusual or unique level of demand on the system. In Texas, we already experienced a little bit of this with Bitcoin miners who came to Texas in droves, and also increased grid stress in certain places. But that's an unanswered question right now. Who's going to pay? Is it going to be something that's sort of folded into everybody's rates, or is it just as usually was the case in the past, or is this something special where we need to charge the people who are suddenly adding huge loads to the system.
And this question of cost allocation is blood sport. I mean, when
Yeah.
you're thinking about transmission or demand, how it fits in, who pays, whether it's the people causing the need for upgrades on the system, or if you call it peanut buttering or uplifting in Texas,
Yeah,
right?
right.
Spreading it across everybody. I mean, every system has slightly different ways of doing that, and it really discourages new innovations or not. So, in the back, very back.
David Tuck. I'm here from Nashua, New Hampshire, and I'm studying at the Geisel School of Medicine, Masters of Public Health. Given the CO2 has natural remediation in the environment with plants, trees, mangroves, and methane, according to the IPCC, is 80 times worse for the environment, are you seeing in academia, like we are in industry, a shift towards talking more about methane and less about CO2? It seems to be a one-song record over there.
Yeah, well, I think most of the academic treatment of the issue uses the word CO2 to mean CO2 equivalent, and they include all greenhouse gases. But you're right, there's more focus on methane even in academia, I think, in part because it's a more potent greenhouse gas, and in part because it's shorter lived in the atmosphere, and we think that if we can sort of get that near-term stuff out of the atmosphere, we provide more benefit that way. The Obama administration and now the Biden administration has resurrected some methane leakage rules that were repealed by the Trump administration. This is part of the whipsawing we see in environmental law generally, depending upon who's in the White House. The super majors are fine with that methane leakage rule. They, in fact, urged the Trump administration not to repeal it, but the independents, which are much bigger in number of companies,
Independent oil producers hated that rule because it would, they weren't wealthy like the big super majors, and they would have to spend a lot of money to control methane leakage. University of Texas does a lot of work on understanding methane leakage, and you probably already know that a huge percentage of the problem is attributable to a few really bad sites, right? And so it's an eminently solvable problem, it's a solvable problem that I think that's going to become one of the bipartisan issues that we can bite off and actually attack, because nobody wants to waste, a useful product in that way, and I don't think it's super costly to solve. I would like to invite you, as we're wrapping up, to leave everybody with kind of your grand statement and summary and kind of words going forward, and then after that, I'll thank you for coming. But please,
sure. I mean,
30 seconds.
That went fast.
I know, it's fun.
So I'm happy to hang around if people have questions that didn't get asked, but I'm not going up somewhere else right away, I don't think. I think the big message of the book is really the one that is Bertrand Russell's quote right there. It's about being vigilant about the way you are being spun all the time nowadays, especially if you're online, and trying to force yourself to think critically about the things that you want to be true, right? We all naturally think critically about the things, the opposing arguments. Our brains zero in on those, automatically. But it's easy to get sort of misled into too credulously believing the things that you want to be true that might not be true or might have qualifiers associated with them. As I said in the class that I visited this morning, if you're reading a news story about this issue and dopamine hits are going off in your brain, that's a sign that you need to go double check to make sure that what you're reading is actually right. Think about, I used to give my students, and I mentioned this in the book, an assignment back in the days when people disagreed about climate science. I used to tell the ones that doubted climate science to go figure out what the strongest arguments were for climate science, and the ones who were believers to do the opposite. And it had an effect. They really reported that their parts of their views changed as a result of that. And we have to sort of do some of that on our own, I think, now to get the full story sometimes.
So your book is available in the back with Sam from Norwich Bookstore, and the largest stack you've ever seen.
Yes.
And I really just want to thank you so much for coming to Dartmouth, for spending this time with us, for hanging out with students and visiting classes. It's a joy to have you.
Well,
it's a
thank
joy
you so
to
much
see
for
you.
having me. It's been
And
delightful.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Great to see you. Thank you,
Thank
everybody.
you. Thank you. It's been great.